In Oregon in 1996, a man kidnapped his wife and son at gunpoint, torched his own truck, and was in a standoff with police for over 10 hours. He was convicted and should have been incarcerated for 70 years. But 2 decades later, he resurfaced when he was caught after stabbing a woman to death in the parking lot of a gas station. This shocking event left the people of Oregon wondering, how did this happen? On a cold, snowy January morning in 2017, a fuel attendant at a gas station in Ontario, Oregon, was waiting to fill up Anthony Montwheeler's truck. While Monthwheeler ran into the store to prepay for $40 worth of diesel and purchase 2 water bottles, the attendant heard a sound coming from the cab of the truck. Curious and a little confused, he looked over and, to his shock, he saw a woman in the passenger seat holding up her arms, with her wrists bound to the seatbelt using plastic zip ties. She made eye contact with him and screamed, "Help me." At that very moment, Monthwheeler exited the store and the fuel attendant realized he had to do something fast. Once Monthwheeler got back to the truck, the attendant looked at him and said, "Just give me a minute, I have to go inside." Since Monthwheeler was dependent on the attendant to pump the gas, he patiently waited. The attendant went inside and frantically told the clerk, "There's a lady tied up in the truck," and then instructed the clerk to call the police. When the attendant got back to the truck, Monthwheeler was casually sitting with one leg just hanging out of the open door of his truck. The attendant went on to fuel the truck, and when Monthwheeler tried to leave, he told him to wait because the cops were coming. Monthwheeler, after hearing that, paused for a second, reached for something beneath the driver's seat, and then quickly pulled out a knife, plunging it into the woman's neck. A customer inside the store heard the commotion and ran outside to help. Him and the fuel attendant tried to intervene, but Monthwheeler fought them off with his left hand while repeatedly stabbing the woman in the neck and chest with his right hand. He then slammed the truck door shut and took off through a snowbank and onto the main road. Police caught up to him and gave chase, following Monthwheeler onto a 2-lane highway. Within minutes, Monthwheeler swerved into the oncoming lane and hit a Ford Excursion while going 90 miles an hour. The Ford Excursion held a married couple named Jessica and David Bate. Jessica survived with severe injuries. Monthwheeler survived with minor injuries, and both David and the kidnapped woman, who was later identified as Anita Harmon, were pronounced dead at the scene. Monthwheeler was then taken to a hospital to Boise, Idaho, where he was monitored. Looking through Monthwheeler's truck, officers later found an empty package of latex gloves, heavy-duty zip ties, duct tape, 100 feet of rope, a small pair of binoculars, and a bloodied fillet knife. Continuing their investigation, they pulled his record and found it was stacked with criminal endeavors. It included multiple counts of theft and attempted fraud. But interestingly enough, there was only one previous incident of violence. You'd think with a rap sheet as long as his and being involved in such a bloody crime, Monthwheeler would have a series of violent criminal activities on his record, but he didn't. That being said, this one single violent crime was heinous enough to leave police officers wondering, what was he doing outside of prison? See, 2 decades earlier, in 1996, Monthwheeler was charged with kidnapping a previous wife of his and their son at gunpoint. But what made his case so unique and explained why he was found free roaming around in a truck is that he had been found guilty except for insanity, meaning he had traded incarceration for remaining relatively free while under state jurisdiction for the maximum possible sentence for his crime, which was 70 years. So, he kidnapped a previous wife and his son at gunpoint, avoided incarceration because he pleaded insanity, was put under state jurisdiction for 70 years, yet 20 years later was responsible for the death of 2 people. How exactly did that happen? Let's go back all the way to Monthwheeler's kidnapping crime in 1996 because that's really where it starts. In March of that year, he had arranged to meet in a parking lot in Oceanside, California with his then wife, Rosa Carrasco. They had met each other in 1989, got married, and had a son named Emilio. Following a change in Monthwheeler's personality and actions, such as becoming withdrawn, disappearing for hours at night, and missing work, Monthwheeler and Rosa split, and Monthwheeler went back to Oregon. This particular meeting was set up to discuss getting a divorce. Rosa showed up to the parking lot with their son Emilio and hopped into Monthwheeler's truck. Monthwheeler unexpectedly pulled onto the highway and announced that there had been a change of plans. He was convinced that him and Rosa just needed some time together and that they would work out all their problems. He then drove 15 hours to Baker City, which is in Northeast Oregon, where his brother Monty lived. Rosa must have acquiesced to this initial change in plans, although arguably there was coercion, because for 2 months they stayed in a rented trailer together. But the thing is, apparently Monthwheeler descended into complete madness during this time period. Rosa found a stash of newspaper clippings about men who got away with murdering their wives. Monthwheeler would talk on a payphone with a dead friend of his from his time in the Marines, and he became incredibly abusive towards Rosa. Desperate, Rosa planned to escape from Montwheeler with her brother Javier's help, but the plan turned into a catastrophe when Montwheeler grew suspicious, grabbed Rosa and Amelia, threw them into his pickup truck, and sped off down the highway. At one point, he pulled over to allegedly collect his thoughts, and as he was doing so, Rosa jumped out of the truck and screamed for help on the shoulder of the highway. Montwheeler immediately pulled out his .22 caliber rifle and pointed it at Amelia's head, ordering Rosa to get back inside the truck or else. He then bound their wrists to the seatbelt, looked Rosa in the eyes, and said, "If you're going to leave me, I'm going out in a blaze of glory." They eventually ended up at Monty's house, where a confrontation between Montwheeler, and Javier ensued. Rosa was able to work herself free, and although she tried to take Amelia with her, the 3-year-old was terrified, and just way too terrified to leave. So she fled, leaving Emilio behind. As the situation continued to escalate, Montwheeler grabbed his rifle and Emilio, and then ran into his brother's house. The police showed up, and Montwheeler fired a series of warning shots, and then lit his own truck on fire. After 10 hours, the situation was de-escalated, and Montwheeler was taken into custody. Thankfully, neither Rosa nor Emilio were killed or physically injured. Montwheeler went to trial in 1997 and testified that his actions were guided by the voice of his dead mother, who had been tragically shot and killed by his own father when Montwheeler was a little boy. While in jail for the crime, he attempted to kill himself and talked about demons. At the trial, he pleaded not guilty for reason of insanity. From the jump, there was debate over whether he met the criteria. A state psychiatrist concluded that Montwheeler was depressed due to their circumstances, but that he did not have any mental illnesses that qualified him for the insanity defense. But a private psychologist disagreed. His report noted that Montwheeler heard his mother's voice and the voice of a man he saw die during his military service. On top of that, the psychologist pointed to an array of other symptoms and concluded Montwheeler suffered from bipolar disorder. The judge sided with the defense witness and deemed Montwheeler criminally insane. He was placed into the review board's custody for up to 70 years, which was the maximum sentence for the crime he committed. Over the following 19 years, Montwheeler lived at the state hospital 4 separate times, but he was otherwise allowed to live in the community while being overseen by the Psychiatric Security Review Board, or PSRB for short. During this 19-year stint, he was convicted of multiple crimes and served prison sentences for some of those crimes, but never for his initial kidnapping crime. Also during this time, he was with a few different women. One woman in particular highlighted his dual nature, his dark side and light side. Roberta Chandler began dating Montwheeler in 2003, shortly after he was released from the institution for the very first time. She was in love with him, and he treated her like a queen, according to her. But then she also pointed out that there was this awful Tony being his nickname based on Anthony, his full name. She believed that Montwheeler was playing and manipulating everyone and everything to get whatever he wanted. They broke up after a while, and he eventually went on to meet and marry Anita Harmon in 2010. In 2012, Montwheeler ended up in county jail after being convicted of stealing $14,000 worth of steel from an elderly couple. While in prison, him and Anita kept in contact. In 2014, Montwheeler was sent from prison to the state hospital, and around this time, state officials decided they wanted to move him out of the hospital. But they specified he needed to be moved to a secure location away from his family or active crime victims, or else they feared he would likely target them and become violent again. Which they really should have paused here and considered whether releasing him was really in anyone's best interest, because if they knew he was going to target family members and would likely become violent again, why let him out at all? But the thing is, when they tried to let him out, no residential facilities on the outside wanted to house him. And I'm not really sure why, but given his criminal activity and all of that, I'm really not surprised. My guess is that's why. As a result, Montwheeler was facing 50 years inside the state hospital. In response to all of this, Montwheeler asserted that he was not actually insane and that he had been tricking the doctors for the last 20 years. Now, this was the first time he said anything of this nature. In 2016, he told the review board that he'd been using the system and that he was done. He then went on and said, "I basically made that up to make myself sound crazy. I didn't hear anything. I was just saying that's what I was hearing." The PSRB is required to discharge anyone who no longer medically qualifies for its jurisdiction, no matter the danger this individual may pose to the public. So, after finding out that Monthwheeler was not in fact mentally ill or insane under legal categorization, the PSRB discharged him and he was free to live among the community, successfully avoiding the remaining 50 years of his sentence. Now, while Monthwheeler was in the hospital, him and Anita had gotten a divorce, and what followed was a series of financial disputes. What made things even worse is that he got a job where Anita worked, making the fighting almost constant. At one point, he threatened to release sex videos of him and Anita. While all of this was going on, he got a new girlfriend, Nicole Krill, but his past problems with insomnia crept back up, and he later admitted that his loss of sleep was one of the major warning signs, and it began right before he kidnapped Rosa. So I guess he feared it might happen again, or at least he said, allegedly. At around 4 a.m. the day of the killings, he told Nicole he was going to his brother's place. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but the police later found Anita's car a half a mile away from her home, parked in the middle of the road, with the headlights still on, the keys still in the ignition. So it sounds like he intercepted her, pulled her out of her car, and dragged her into his truck, where he bound her with zip ties to the seatbelt. And that's when he drove all the way from Idaho, which is where Anita lived, back to Oregon, and ended up at the gas station where he murdered her. The big debate here is whether Monthwheeler was actually insane at the time he pled insanity in 1997, or if he was actually gaming the system the entire time. So, to analyze this, let's dive into Monthwheeler's personal history, the history of mental illness institutions in America, and the creation of PSRB to get a better understanding of what actually happened here. Anthony Monthwheeler was born in November of 1967. His mother, Lenny, was 21 years old, and his father, Wayne, was 59. Wayne was described as a con man who was physically abusive and showed frequent signs of mental instability. At one point, he took an axe to his family's furniture and then poured paint all over their house. On another occasion, he was found wearing women's clothing while watching Lenny through the window of the beauty shop where she worked. After 7 years, when Montwheeler was only 6 years old, Lenny planned on leaving him, but Wayne cornered her in a parking lot and shot her with a .22 caliber handgun, killing her. Montwheeler and his brother Monty went to live with Lenny's older sister and her husband. The family had 3 children of their own. In high school, Montwheeler was a 3-sport athlete who loved to fish and hunt. He was also very handy, and his cousin once said he could build or weld anything. But people also noted something was wrong with him or off with him. For example, their neighbor's dog would bark whenever someone walked past the house to the barn. One night, Montwheeler announced that they wouldn't have to worry about the dog anymore, because turns out he took his truck and just ran over it. When he was told to bury the dog, he barely tried to dig a small hole and then crammed the dog's body in the hole, showing no respect and no remorse for his actions at all. After high school, he joined the Marines, but left the service in 1989, where he moved to Oceanside, California, and where he met Rosa Carrasco, his first known victim, the woman he later married, had a kid with, and then kidnapped at gunpoint. The rest we already discussed: the kidnapping, the subsequent trial, his insanity plea, his experience with the PSRB, and how it all culminated in the killings of 2 innocent people. But to truly understand what happened here, we also have to look at the mechanisms at play that made this possible. See, in 1963, after inhumane conditions were exposed in many of the United States psychiatric hospitals, President John F. Kennedy vowed to reform the system in favor of outpatient treatment. He wanted to remove the reliance on the cold mercy of custodial isolation and supplant that with the open warmth of community concern and capability. He wanted to provide funding for community facilities that served people with mental disabilities. But 1 month after signing this new legislation, JFK was assassinated and was never able to see this plan through. As a result, the community mental health centers never saw stable funding. The numbers reflect this tragic situation. Although people with mental illnesses were granted greater legal protections, hundreds of asylums were shut down. Between the years of 1955 and 1980, the population in state psychiatric hospitals dropped from 559,000 patients to just 154,000 patients. While this was part of the plan, the former patients left the institutions with no community or support in place to catch them. Hospitalization costs began to really increase in the 1960s, and both the federal and state governments wanted to find less expensive alternatives to hospitalization. The 1965 amendments to Social Security shifted about 50% of the mental health care costs from the states to the federal government, which then motivated them to further promote deinstitutionalization. Following all of this, indirect cost shifting occurred that some argue led to the new form of institutionalization, or one could call it reinstitutionalization. There was an increased use of jail detention for those with mental disorders that were seen as unmanageable or non-compliant. When laws were enacted that required communities to take more responsibility for mental health care, the funding was usually absent, and so the communities made the jail or the jails the default option since it was significantly cheaper than psychiatric care. In 1960, there were around 55,000 individuals with serious mental illnesses in state and federal prisons. But by 2014, that number jumped to 392,000. Seeing all of this, Oregon decided to run what you could call an experiment in 1977. And I don't mean an experiment in a bad way. Enacting new laws and policies usually are experiments. Our entire country is an experiment technically. But anyway, Oregon created the PSRB in 1977, and this was the first agency for insanity acquittals in the entire United States that operated outside of the prison system. When someone receives PSRB oversight, they get a regular case manager, mental health care, and they receive work placement. Offenders are usually placed under state jurisdiction for the maximum length of time that sentencing guidelines allow. There are around 600 offenders that are overseen by the PSRB, and the majority of them aren't in state hospitals, but instead are living in Oregon communities. Each county in Oregon has a designated mental health center, and the offenders have access to it. The services run around $18,000 per month per case, or in other words, for each person. This is relatively controversial though, because most of the PSRB's offenders have been charged with some of the most serious crimes, like kidnapping, rape, and murder. That being said, the PSRB estimates that the recidivism rate is around 0.5%, meaning these people do not reoffend in the vast majority of cases. This is in stark contrast to the recidivism rates of regular felons or people that don't fall under PSRB, with studies indicating that about 50 to 60% of individuals released from prison will be rearrested within 3 years. And on top of that, around 200,000 ex-offenders with severe mental illnesses are currently living throughout the United States. And the stats say around 77% of that population will be rearrested within 5 years, many for violent crimes. Now, a lot of people might be concerned about the abuse of the insanity plea, and given the story I just told you, it's something someone can abuse. Maybe, if you think Montwheeler was actually abusing it. I'll share my opinion at the very end of this video. But before we do that, I'm going to put on my lawyer hat and explain how insanity as a defense works in the US. Okay, there are actually 4 different rules or tests used by US courts, depending on the situation and or the jurisdiction. We first have the Monotony Rule, which comes from the first famous legal test for insanity, which occurred in 1843 when Englishman Daniel Monotony shot and killed the secretary of the British Prime Minister because he believed the Prime Minister was conspiring against him. With the Monotony test, a defendant is deemed to be legally insane if he was unaware of what he was doing when the offense was committed, or even if he knew what he was doing, the defendant was incapable of understanding that what he was doing was wrong. The Monotony Rule is the standard for insanity in the US and the UK and is still the standard for insanity in almost half of the US states. It's traditionally associated with schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. Okay, second, we then have the irresistible impulse test, which is for a defendant who may have known her actions were wrong but committed them anyway because of an irresistible impulse. Here, the defendant recognizes the wrongness of the offense, but she was compelled to commit it anyway. She could not control her actions. This test is more traditionally used when the defendant suffers from mania or paraphilias. It's also a riskier test because it's harder to evaluate the strength of the defendant's claim, and it can be over-inclusive. The third one is the Durham rule, which is actually only used in New Hampshire and places a huge emphasis on scientific psychological evaluation and evidence. Generally, juries will follow the diagnosis made by trained professionals when determining whether the defendant is guilty or not. It's not a very popular test, though, because it takes the decision-making out of the jury's hands and places it into the hands of a psychologist. Finally, we have the Model Penal Code, which is essentially a combo M'Naughton rule and irresistible impulse test. It broadens the M'Naughton rule, but also includes the volition aspect of the irresistible impulse test. This test is usually used by states that don't use the M'Naughton rule, and it prohibits psychopaths and sociopaths from using it as a defense. Despite all of these potential defenses, insanity as a defense is pursued fewer than 1% of the time, and is only successful about a quarter of the 1%. So essentially, if Monthwheeler successfully faked his own insanity to avoid incarceration, that seems to be a very rare and close to impossible occurrence. Nonetheless, and understandably so, people were outraged by this, and they targeted PSRB as a result. The Montwheeler Enterprise, and I hope I said that right, they got a grant from ProPublica, a nonprofit news outlet, and they launched an investigation into how the PSRB put the public at risk. In addition, the families of Anita Harmon and David Bates sued the state and the PSRB for $3.75 million and $500,000 million, respectively. The PSRB turned around and blamed the initial diagnosis of Montwheeler, arguing that he faked his mental illness and never should have been under their jurisdiction in the first place. And that decision to put him under their jurisdiction was something that occurred in the trial. They had no say in it. And then once Montwheeler was not insane, PSRB was legally required to discharge him. At this point, honestly, my question is more aimed at who set this program up, because there was a loophole that was potentially exploited in this situation. That being said, when writing laws and policies, it's close to impossible to predict every potential bad consequence or loophole until they happen. Now, back to the main story here, because I want to let you know how this situation ended. In June of 2017, around 5 months after he murdered his ex-wife and killed David Bates, he was ordered to the state hospital to determine if he was fit for trial. In 2018, the hospital reported he was not fit to help in his own defense. But later that year, the hospital then reported he was fit for trial. In 2019, the judge found Montwheeler also fit for trial, and a month later, Montwheeler pled not guilty to all charges. But in an odd change of events, he then came back in 2021 to plead guilty on all counts. For killing Anita, he was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 25 years, when he was 78 years old. That being said, if that occurs, he will also have to serve another 10 years of the 20-year sentence he agreed to for David's death. He also has to serve a 3-year sentence for injuring Jessica, but that's served as part of the overall sentence, not on top of the other sentences. So, wrapping all of this up, we have a very detailed story about a man who potentially tricked the government and a lot of other people by pleading insanity. Now, it's somewhat debated about whether he was actually insane or he faked it or what was actually going on there, but after looking at all of this, here's my opinion. I think he faked it and manipulated and took advantage of the system and of people. I think he definitely suffers from a mental illness. I just don't think it's to the degree where someone would not be found guilty of a crime. He actually kind of reminds me of Matthew Mueller, who's a man I did a video on a while back. I'll link it here. He's the guy involved in what the media called the real-life Gone Girl case. Mueller was and is highly intelligent, manipulative, abusive, was in the military. That's more of a random similarity, but I just thought it was interesting, had great success with women, and yet committed atrocious crimes against women. So I see a lot of similarities here. He also had and has a severe mental illness that caused massive paranoia and potential hallucinations. So here's what I'm thinking. Are these guys fucked up? For sure. Were they unaware they were committing heinous crimes? No. Were they unable to resist it? Arguably, I'm going to say no. Here's the thing, mental illness is a struggle, and I don't want to downplay that struggle at all, but we cannot remove culpability in heinous crimes, especially repeat crimes, just because someone has a mental illness. We need to be very careful when looking at these cases, because obviously the consequences are incredibly damaging to innocent people and the communities in these states or cities or in our country. What also further adds to my conclusion in this case is the fact that Monthwheeler, when he kidnapped Anita, drove 20 miles over the border from Idaho into Oregon. Idaho does not have an insanity defense, let alone the PSRB. After facing an issue where the PSRB was no longer overseeing him and he didn't have access to the PSRB community housing or centers, did he plan to commit a crime in Oregon to get back under PSRB care? He didn't want to be in a mental institution, but he also didn't want to take full responsibility for his life. He wanted an entity to make life easier for him, to give him health care and housing and everything else, while also being able to live outside and free in our communities. So it seems like, to me, there was motive and action to support my conclusion that he was not mentally ill enough to actually plead the insanity defense, and therefore he tricked everyone. Although that's my conclusion, you may have a different one, and I'd love to hear it. So let me know in the comments what you think. I also want to hear what you guys think about how we should handle severe mental illness in America, what you think about the PSRB program in Oregon, if there's a fix for our ever-growing prison system, and really anything else that I may have forgotten to mention at this point in time. But I'd love to talk to you guys about it, so comment. And then until next time, stay safe and stay curious.